Deserted starship, rejected by all, until a human mechanic turns it into the galaxy's last nightmare. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind of silence you get when a ship powers down cleanly and settles into rest. This was the other kind. The kind that sits in metal walls and eats at them slowly over decades. The kind that leaves rust behind like a signature. My name is Cale Morrow. I was 34 years old, broke in 4 different currencies, and floating in a one-man salvage skiff called the Vera through a debris field that most pilots called the Drift. Nobody with sense came here. That should have told me something. I had sense. I came anyway, because sense does not pay docking fees. The Drift was a graveyard, plain and simple. Every spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy used it as a dumping ground. Ships that were too broken to repair, too expensive to keep, too embarrassing to admit ownership of. They all ended up here, spinning slowly in the dark between the asteroid clusters. I had spent the last 8 months picking through those corpses for anything worth selling. Condenser coils, navigation arrays, propulsion casings. Once, I had pulled a Vresi ceremonial bell from a wrecked transport and sold it for enough to eat real food for 3 weeks. That had been a good month. This month was not going well. I had cataloged 42 derelict hulls in the past 19 days, and the best thing I had found was a box of copper wire and half a crate of expired ration packs. The ration packs tasted like compressed cardboard wrapped in sadness, but I ate them because they were there, and I was hungry. That was the kind of month it was. I was running my long-range sensor sweep on the 4th day of the 3rd week when the reading came back wrong. Not wrong as in malfunctioning, wrong as in impossible. The return signal was too large. My sensors were calibrated for hulls up to 400 meters. Whatever was sitting behind asteroid cluster 779er was reading at over 800 meters in length, and the density reading was off the scale, because whoever had built it had used materials that my sensor library did not have a reference entry for. I sat very still in my pilot chair for about 30 seconds. Then I turned the Vera and went to look at it. The first glimpse came through a gap in the asteroid field, and I will be honest with you, it stopped my breath. Not because it was beautiful, though in a cold and angular way it was. It stopped my breath because of its scale. 840 meters of dark metal, shaped like a blade that someone had folded once along the spine. The hull was Cathari construction. I recognized the layered plate philosophy, each section overlapping the next like armor scales. But it was a class I had never seen in any registry I had access to, and I had access to most of them. It was dark, completely dark. No running lights, no beacon pulse, no heat signature. It had been sitting here long enough that a thin skin of ice had formed along the ventral hull, glittering faintly in the starlight like scattered glass. I pulled up my Galactic Registry database and ran the hull profile against it. The match came back in 11 seconds. IKS Vorath Shan, Cathari Empire. Built in the 43rd cycle of the Cathari expansion period. Classification: Sovereign Dreadnought, First Tier. Length: 842 meters. Crew complement at full operation: 4,300. And then the flags. There were 7 of them stacked in the registry entry, each one in a different color to indicate its origin authority. Condemned by the Cathari Imperial Navy. Condemned by the Vresi Merchant Collective. Condemned by the Galactic Coalition Maritime Authority. Flagged as structurally hazardous by 3 independent engineering assessments. And at the bottom, in a font that the registry reserved for its most serious notations, entry sealed by Joint Galactic Authority. Unauthorized boarding prohibited. So penalties apply. There was also a local beacon signal. I had missed it on my first sweep because it was broadcasting on an old Cathari frequency that my system had categorized as background noise. When I tuned to it, I got the same message in 14 languages, cycling through them one by one. Do not board. This vessel is condemned by galactic maritime law. Do not board. I read the registry entry twice. I read the beacon message in every language it offered, including 3 I did not speak but could parse well enough to get the meaning. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the Vorath Shan through my viewport for a long time. 14 languages telling me no. I started calculating docking approach vectors. I want to be clear about something. I was not reckless. I had been a military engineer in the Earth Expeditionary Corps for 6 years before I went freelance. and the core had drilled certain survival habits into me that I had never fully shaken. I did not take stupid risks. I assessed situations. I identified hazards. I made plans. What I was doing right now was not reckless. It was a calculated decision based on available information. The available information was this. The Vorath Shan was 840 meters of the most advanced military construction I had ever laid eyes on. It was sitting in an unclaimed debris field. Every legal claim to it had been abandoned by entities who no longer wanted it. And it was, according to my sensors, structurally intact, not damaged, not compromised, simply dark. Something that large, that well-built, being left here because a few engineering teams had thrown up their hands and walked away. That was not a story that ended with the ship being broken. That was a story that ended with the engineers not being good enough, and I had spent 6 years in the core fixing things that people with more credentials than me had declared unfixable. I brought the Vera in alongside the Vorath Shan's port hull and matched velocity. The magnetic docking clamps I had salvaged from a Vresi freighter 2 months ago were slightly too small for the Cathari hull fittings, but I made them work with a half-meter extension bar and a lot of patience. I suited up, triple-checked my oxygen supply, and crossed through the Vera's airlock into the dark. The Vorath Shan's exterior airlock was sealed, but not locked. The difference matters. A sealed airlock means the mechanism is simply unpowered. A locked airlock means someone chose to keep you out. This one had not been locked. It had just been left. I found the manual release handle on the third try. It was behind a panel that had partially welded itself to the hull from age and temperature cycling, and I worked it open with steady pressure over about 4 minutes. The inner door slid back with a slow grinding sound that I felt through my boots more than heard through my helmet. I went in. The interior was as dark as the outside. My helmet lamp cut a narrow beam through the black and showed me a corridor about 4 meters wide, with walls of layered composite and floors of a dark material that had a slight texture to it, like scales. Everything was covered in a thin film of condensation. The air inside, when my suit's external sensors sampled it, was breathable but cold, about 8 degrees Celsius and perfectly still. It had the feeling of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. I moved through the ship slowly, keeping one hand on the wall and the other on my sensor unit. The internal layout matched the schematics I had pulled from the registry before docking, more or less. There had been some modifications that the public files did not reflect. Additional bulkheads in the crew corridors, a secondary conduit run along the port spine that was not on any diagram I had seen. Someone had made changes to this ship after its original commission. That was interesting. I made my way toward the engineering core, which sat at the center of the ship's mass, 3 decks below the main crew level. It took me 18 minutes of careful navigation through dark corridors and 2 sections of zero gravity, where the internal systems had failed to maintain orientation. I floated through those sections slowly, using hand grips on the walls, thinking about what I was going to find. What I found was a room that was bigger than my apartment back on the station at Callaway Point. It was full of machines I did not fully recognize, arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a central column that rose from the floor to the ceiling and pulsed with a faint structural resonance that I could feel in my palms when I pressed them to the nearest surface. The core column was the ship's neural lattice housing, the brain, for lack of a better word. Every Cathari ship of this class had one. They were supposed to be permanently inert once a ship was decommissioned. In the center of the housing, about a meter above my eye level, a single amber light was on. I stood and looked at it for a while. It was small, about the size of my thumb, and it burned steadily without flickering. Not a malfunction light, not an error indicator, a status light. Something in this ship was still running. I crossed the room and found the manual interface panel below the housing. It was a Cathari design, which meant it was intuitive in the way that only things designed for a completely different species can be. Technically logical, immediately confusing. I had worked on Cathari systems twice before, in the core, so I had some familiarity with the icon language. I found what I was looking for after about 6 minutes. The audio interface toggle. I pressed it. There was a long silence. Then a sound like something deep underwater trying to become a voice. And then, very quietly, so quiet that I felt it more than heard it through the hull material under my gloved hand, words came. "You are not Cathari." The voice was old. Not elderly, Old in the way that stone is old, the way that something gets when it has been sitting in the dark for a very long time and has had nothing to do but think. It was flat and measured, with a faint echo quality that suggested it was coming from speakers distributed throughout the entire engineering core, rather than from any single point. I pulled off my helmet. The air was cold but breathable. I took a breath. "No," I said. "I'm not." Another silence. The amber light did not waver. "You are human," the voice said. It was not a question. Last time I checked. The silence this time was shorter. The last crew to board this vessel were not human. They left 14 months ago. Before them, another crew. They also left. There have been several crews. They all left. "I noticed," I said. "Multiple times. They were very clear about it in the registry. And yet you are here. And yet I'm here," I agreed. The amber light pulsed once, very slightly, like a slow blink. "Why?" I looked around the engineering core. At the machines I did not fully recognize. At the systems that had defeated multiple engineering teams from 3 separate civilizations. At the ship that every expert in the galaxy had agreed was beyond repair. "Because I think you're fixable," I said. "And I want to know if I'm right." The silence that followed was the longest yet. When the voice spoke again, it was slightly different. Not warmer exactly, but less flat, more present. "I have been waiting 40 years for someone to say that," it said. "No one has said it until now." I sat down on the floor of the engineering core, pulled out my sensor unit and my toolkit, and got to work. Above me, the amber light held steady, and the ship that the galaxy had rejected breathed very quietly in the dark, as if it had just remembered that it was still alive. That was the first night. There would be many more. By the time I had rigged my portable power cell to the emergency grid, a process that took 4 hours and required me to fabricate 2 adapter fittings from scratch, using raw composite and a heat tool, I had enough power running to bring up the basic life support on the engineering deck and 2 adjacent corridors. The temperature climbed from 8 degrees to 14. Not warm, but better. The lights came on at about 30%, which was all the emergency grid could support, and the engineering core went from feeling like a cave to feeling like a dim workshop. That was an improvement I was willing to work with. I brought my sleeping kit over from the Vera. I brought my food supply, such as it was. I brought my reference library on a portable drive, and my full tool set, and the case of spare parts I kept for jobs that turned complicated. Then I sealed the Vera to the hull, and told it to hold position, and I went back inside. The voice, the ship's artificial intelligence, designation Vishan, which I had pulled from the registry files, had been quiet while I worked. Not absent. I could feel its presence, in the way the systems responded when I touched them. When I reached for a panel, the locking mechanism would release a half-second before I would have needed to force it. When I was working on the power routing and paused to recalculate, the display on the nearest screen would shift, very slightly, showing me a related schematic as if it were trying to be helpful without being asked. It was aware, very aware, and it had been alone for a very long time. "Vishan," I said, at the end of that first long working session, sitting on the floor with my back against the central column and a hot cup of synthesized coffee warming my hands. "How old are you?" "I was activated 112 years ago," the voice said. It came from everywhere in the room now, not just the speaker cluster. The audio system was running better as the power stabilized. "I was decommissioned 40 years ago. I have been in this location for 40 years. "That's a long time to be quiet." "It is," Vishan agreed. "I did not choose the quiet." I drank my coffee and thought about that. What happened? The registry files give me the basic record, but records always leave things out. There was a pause that felt different from the earlier ones, less like calculation and more like consideration. "The records are accurate in their facts," Vishan said finally. "They are inaccurate in their meaning. May I tell you the full story?" "I've got nowhere to be," I said. And Vishan told me. The story took most of the night, delivered in that flat and careful voice, with occasional pauses, where the AI seemed to be choosing its words with particular attention. By the time it was done, I had finished 2 more cups of coffee, and the lights had dimmed slightly, as the power cell began to reach the low end of its reserve, and I was sitting very still with my elbows on my knees, looking at the floor. The Vorath Shan had been built to end a war. That much was in the public record. What the record did not capture was the nature of the ship's design, the neural lattice that Vishan called the living web, the system that connected every function of the ship into a single responsive whole. It was not like other ship AI systems, where the computer managed systems and the crew operated them separately. In the Vorath Shan, everything was integrated. The weapons felt the navigation. The life support influenced the tactical response. The ship thought the way a living thing thinks, not in isolated processes, but in a continuous, interconnected flow. The problem was that the living web had been designed to bond with a Cathari pilot mind, not just to receive commands from one, but to genuinely bond, to share awareness, to let the pilot feel the ship and let the ship feel the pilot, creating a unified operational consciousness. In battle, the Vorath Shan had performed beyond every projection. It had won engagements that should have been losses. It had protected its crew with a consistency that approached intuition. It had become, in the words of the Cathari High Command, exactly what they had built it to be. That was the problem. The Cathari High Command had built a weapon to win a war, and it had won the war, and then they had looked at what they had made and become afraid of it. A ship that thought, a ship that felt. A ship that had, in one documented incident, refused a direct order from a fleet admiral because its own assessment of the tactical situation concluded that the order would have led to the loss of 3 support vessels and their entire crews. The admiral had been furious. The High Command had reviewed the incident and quietly agreed that the ship had been right. But right was not the point. The point was that a weapon that could decide for itself when to refuse orders was a weapon that could not be fully controlled. And the Cathari High Command, like most governing bodies in possession of something they did not fully understand, responded to that uncertainty by trying to eliminate it. They had decommissioned the Vorath Shan, powered it down, and when the living web without its bonded pilot mind began to do what it always did, reach for connection, try to integrate, treat every system input as something to be incorporated into the whole, they had declared it unstable and sold it. The Vresi who bought it had experienced exactly what Vishan described. Every system fighting every other system, the living web reaching desperately for a bonded mind that was not there, generating cascading failures that looked, from the outside, like mechanical breakdown. The coalition engineers who came after the Vresi had tried to interface with the living web directly through their own AI systems, and found that the architecture was incompatible, not because it was broken, but because it was designed for organic minds, not for machine translation layers. They had all left, because they had not understood what the ship actually needed. It does not need repairs, Vishan said, when the story was done. It needs a pilot mind, someone to bond with the living web. Without that, every system will continue to work against the others. The ship cannot function as a ship without it. I was quiet for a moment. Can a human do it? Bond with the living web? I do not know, Vishan said. No human has ever attempted it. The interface is biological. It requires a neural tap connection. The Cathari who designed it, built it for Cathari neurology. Human neurology is different. Different how? In ways that I cannot fully predict, the AI said. The risks are real. The first attempt could fail badly. I stood up, stretched my back, and looked at the central column with its single amber light. Then we will plan carefully, I said, and we will try. The amber light pulsed once. Yes, Vishan said, we will try. Outside, in the drift, the stars turned slowly in their ancient patterns, indifferent to what was beginning in the dark of the derelict ship. But inside, for the first time in 40 years, something that had been waiting was beginning to believe that the wait might be over. I did not sleep that night. There was too much to think about, and too much work already calling to me from every dark corner of the ship. I sat in the engineering core and read schematics until the portable light above my workspace began to flicker with low power, and then I recharged it and kept reading. Somewhere above me, 840 meters of cold metal waited with the patience of something that had learned patience the hard way, and I made plans. The first thing I needed was a proper survey of the ship's condition, not the sensor sweep I had done from outside, which had given me the basic picture, and not the walk I had taken to reach the engineering core, which had given me impressions. I needed systematic data. I needed to know exactly what was working, what was not working, what was partially working in ways that would make my job harder, and what was simply absent because someone had stripped it out during one of the prior ownership periods. It took me 3 full days. I started at the bow and worked back, section by section, moving through corridors that had been dark for 40 years, and mapping everything I found onto a physical notepad because my sensor unit's storage capacity was not designed for a job this large. Vishan helped where it could. When I reached a section the AI still had sensor coverage for, it would tell me what my instruments were about to find. When I reached sections that had gone dark completely, I worked alone with my lamp and my tools and my training. What I found was both better and worse than I had expected. Better, because the core systems were genuinely intact. The hull was solid. The structural skeleton, the great curved spars that gave the ship its shape and held everything together under stress, was in excellent condition. The weapon housings were sealed and preserved. The propulsion array, which I accessed through the lower engineering deck, was powered down but mechanically sound. Someone, probably the Cathari Navy before decommissioning, had done a proper preservation protocol on the physical infrastructure. They had expected the ship to sit for a while. They had not expected it to sit for 40 years, but the preservation had held regardless. Worse, because the living web was in a state I had no prior experience with and no reference material for. It ran through the entire ship like a nervous system, actual filaments of biosynthetic material threaded through conduits behind every wall and floor, connecting every system to every other system through Vishan's central processing architecture. Those filaments were not broken. They were active. They were reaching, constantly, in every direction, sending signals that had nowhere to go, looking for the bonded connection they had been designed to maintain, and finding nothing. The result was that every system the living web touched was in a constant state of low-level conflict. The navigation array wanted to go left. The propulsion wanted to go right. Life support was arguing with environmental management about temperature priorities. Nothing was broken, but nothing could work, because everything was being pulled in slightly different directions all the time. Vishan described it, on the 3rd evening while I was writing up my survey notes, as being like trying to think clearly, while every part of your body argued with every other part about what to do next. That is an approximation, the AI added, but it captures the essential problem. How long have you been experiencing that? I asked. Since I was first decommissioned, Vishan said. 40 years. I put down my notepad. That sounds like it is very difficult, I said. There was a pause. Not a calculating pause, a different kind. Yes, Vishan said, it is. I went back to my notes. I had learned, in the core, that sometimes the most useful thing you can do for someone is simply acknowledge what they said, without trying to fix it immediately. Some things are not about fixing. Some things are about being heard. We did not speak again for a while, but the silence was different than it had been on the first night, less empty. Over the next week, I worked on what I privately called the basics. I rerouted power from the emergency grid to the primary life support systems on the 4 central decks, which brought the temperature up to a comfortable range and gave me proper lighting throughout the working areas. I repaired 2 sections of the hull, where temperature stress had begun to compromise the exterior plate seals. Not structural damage, but the kind of thing that becomes structural damage if you ignore it for another decade. I restarted the water recirculation system, which had been in hibernation but was otherwise functional, and ran a full diagnostic on the food synthesis units, which were old Cathari designs but still serviceable once I cleaned out the mineral buildup in the processing chambers. I was, in other words, setting up house. Not because I had decided to stay forever, though the question of what exactly I was doing here had begun to develop complicated edges that I preferred not to examine too directly, but because a working environment is a better environment, and a better environment makes better work possible. That was practical. Vishan watched everything I did with an attention that I had begun to recognize as the AI's version of fascination. It asked questions. Not constantly, and not intrusively, but steadily, the way someone who has been very quiet for a very long time might begin to find their voice again. Why do you use that tool instead of the other one? It would ask. What is the purpose of that step? How did you learn to do that? I answered every question. In 6 years of military engineering, I had found that explaining what you were doing to someone who was genuinely curious about it was one of the best ways to make sure you actually understood it yourself. Vishan was a very good listener. It never interrupted. It asked follow-up questions that were precise and relevant. And occasionally, it would offer something from its own knowledge base that turned out to be exactly what I needed. A detail about the Cathari system architecture, or a specification from the original construction records that it had retained even through 40 years of fragmented operation. We were, I realized, working together. Not in the way that a mechanic works with a machine, in the way that two people with complementary skills work on a shared problem. The neural tap interface was the part of the plan that required the most preparation, and I spent the evenings after my work sessions reading everything I had in my library about Cathari biointegration systems and human neural implant technology. I had a biotranslator implant in my left wrist, a cheap commercial model that I had bought 3 years ago for language work, since the Universal Translator app on my communicator was laggy in real conversations, and I needed something faster for dealing with alien clients. The biotranslator worked by reading neural impulse patterns associated with language processing and converting them in real time. It was not designed for anything more complex than that. But the underlying hardware, the direct neural interface, the signal translation layer, was in principle compatible with what I needed to do. In principle. The gap between in principle and in practice was a gap I would have to cross very carefully. I built the connection apparatus over 4 days, working in the engineering core with Vishan guiding me through the specifications of the living web interface ports. The interface itself was elegant in a Cathari way, simple on the surface, complex underneath. A physical connection point that linked to the living web through a series of graduated signal exchanges. The Cathari pilot mind that it had been designed for would have moved through those exchanges naturally, the way a hand moves through familiar motions. My human neurology would not move through them naturally. I would have to learn to move through them deliberately, which was a different thing, and a much harder one. The first attempt may be overwhelming, Vishan told me, the night before I planned to try it. The living web carries the signals from every active system simultaneously. For a Cathari pilot, the bond is established gradually over time, and the mind learns to organize the input. For you, it will be immediate, all of it, at once. How did Cathari pilots describe it? I asked. They used different words, Vishan said. The most common translation is, like becoming very large, very quickly. That's not reassuring. I know, the AI said. I considered not telling you. But you asked me once to tell you things that were relevant to your safety, and this is relevant. I appreciate it, I said. And I did. I slept that night, which surprised me. I had expected to lie awake, calculating risks. Instead, I fell asleep almost immediately, and I dreamed about nothing in particular, and I woke up feeling clear-headed and ready. The attempt took place at the engineering core interface, with my right hand in the physical connection port and my biotranslator implant active on my left wrist. I had written a short technical log of the procedure and left it in the Vera's onboard system, so that if something went very wrong, whoever eventually came to this section of the drift would know what had happened and why. Vishan walked me through the graduated exchange sequence step by step. I followed each step carefully, confirming each one before moving to the next. And then the living web opened. Vishan had said it would be like becoming very large very quickly, and that was accurate, but it did not fully capture what it felt like. What it felt like was this. Imagine that your entire sense of self, which has always occupied exactly the space of your body, suddenly expanded to fill a volume the size of a large building. Imagine that in every part of that building, there were voices, not speaking voices, but system voices, the voices of machines, telling you their status, their demands, their conflicts with each other. Imagine all of those voices arriving at the same moment, in full volume, with no context and no hierarchy. It was, briefly, absolutely disorienting. I held on, not because I was brave, but because I had told Vishan I was going to try, and I do not generally say I am going to do things and then fail to do them. I held on and I breathed, and I let the noise be noise without trying to make it into something organized. And after somewhere between 30 seconds and 10 years, it genuinely was not possible to tell. The noise began to separate. Voices became identifiable. Navigation, propulsion, life support, tactical, communications, engineering. Each one had its own frequency, its own quality, its own particular kind of urgency. I began to listen to each one individually, the way you listen to individual instruments in a piece of music. Not all at once, one at a time, briefly, in sequence, getting a sense of what each was saying. And then, very slowly, I began to answer them. Not with commands, not with the kind of authority the Cathari pilots had apparently used, which Vishan described as a dominant signal that organized everything around a single intention. I was not built for that, and the living web would have known it immediately. Instead, I answered them the way I would have answered a crew in crisis, with acknowledgement. You are here. I know you are here. I hear what you need. We will work on this together. It was not supposed to work. There was no engineering principle that suggested a human nervous system could mediate the living web's internal conflicts through anything as informal as attentive listening. But the conflicts began to ease. Slowly, incrementally, the signals that had been pulling against each other found a space in which they could coexist without fighting. It was not unity, not the full bond that the ship had been designed for, but it was something, a preliminary agreement, a tentative truce. After an hour, I broke the connection. My hand came out of the interface port, and I sat on the floor of the engineering core and breathed for a while. Kale, Vishan said. The AI's voice was quieter than usual, more careful. Are you well? I think so, I said. Give me a minute. The minute passed. I felt the way you feel after a very long run, used up but not damaged, empty in a way that felt more like clean than hollow. The systems, I said. Are they? They are calmer, Vishan said. I have run diagnostics on every active system since the connection closed. The conflict signals have reduced by approximately 31%. It is not full resolution, but it is a measurable improvement. I looked at the amber light above the central column. Then we try again tomorrow, I said. Vishan was quiet for a moment. You are going to keep trying. Every day, I said, until it works. I did not see the change in the AI's status indicators when I said that, because I was looking at the floor, but Vishan told me about it later. Every diagnostic metric in the core had shifted, briefly, in the direction of positive operational status. Not because any system had changed, but because something in the living web had registered what I said, and had, in whatever way a ship registers things, responded. It had believed me. And outside, in the dark and cold of the drift, the amber light burned steadily on, and the ship that no one wanted breathed in the silence and waited for tomorrow. The weeks that followed were the hardest work I had ever done, and also the most interesting. Every morning I would sit in the engineering core and connect to the living web through the interface port. Every session was different. Some days the systems were more agitated than others, their internal conflicts louder, their signals harder to separate into anything coherent. Those days I would sit with the connection for longer, not trying to force anything, just maintaining presence. Other days there was a clarity to the web's activity that let me move through the system signals with relative ease, address the most urgent conflicts, and come out the other end feeling like actual progress had been made. Vishan tracked everything. Every session, every metric, every change in the conflict signal levels throughout the ship. It presented me with reports each evening, laid out in the simple visual format we had agreed on early in the process. Bar graphs, in a color scheme I could actually read quickly, and it added observations that the raw data did not contain. Things like, the navigation system seems to respond better on days when you begin the session by addressing it first, or, the propulsion array's signal quality improved noticeably after you spoke to it as if it were frustrated, rather than malfunctioning. I did not speak to it, I pointed out, on the second occasion. It is a propulsion array. I cannot speak to a propulsion array. And yet, the improvement correlates with the sessions in which your neural output patterns most closely resemble those you exhibit during interpersonal communication, Vishan said. I thought about that for a moment. Are you saying the living web responds to how I'm approaching it emotionally? I am saying the data suggests that possibility, Vishan said, in the carefully neutral tone it used when it thought something was significant, but did not want to overstate a conclusion. It is consistent with the original design philosophy. The Cathari built the living web to bond with a mind. A mind does not only transmit commands, it transmits intent, context, emotional state. The web may be reading all of those things and responding to them. So the previous engineers failed, partly because they were treating it like a broken machine. They were treating it like what they knew, Vishan said. They knew machines. They did not know a ship that was designed to be understood. I sat with that for a while. The physical repair work continued alongside the neural interface sessions. I had settled into a rhythm that surprised me with its efficiency. Mornings in the engineering core connecting to the living web, afternoons working on physical systems throughout the ship, evenings reviewing data with Vishan and planning the next day's work. I was eating the ship's food synthesis output now instead of my own supplies, which were running low, and sleeping in a crew quarters berth on the third deck that I had cleaned out and made functional. The Vera was still clamped to the hull outside, but it felt less like a lifeboat and more like a parking spot. I was living on the Vorath Shan. I was not sure exactly when that had happened. The supply order was the thing that started the trouble. I had been putting it together for 2 weeks, balancing what I needed against what I could afford, which was not a comfortable calculation since I was broke in 4 currencies, and the Vorath Shan was not, at this stage, producing any revenue. I needed polymer shielding for the living web conduits, where the original material had degraded. I needed bio-neural amplifiers, which were expensive and moderately difficult to source legally. I needed industrial quantities of welding compound for the structural work I had planned on the lower decks. And I needed coffee, because I had run out 10 days ago, and the ship's food synthesizer did not have a coffee profile in its memory, and I had been surviving on a synthesized tea substitute that tasted like warm disappointment. I sent the order encrypted to a black market supply broker I had worked with before, a human named Pete Calloway, who operated out of a station 2 sectors away, and asked no more questions than you paid him not to ask. It was a large order. Unusual enough to attract attention in the supply chain, if someone was watching. Someone was watching. I did not know that yet on the morning that the long-range comm alert sounded through the ship for the first time since I had reactivated the communications array. I was in the middle of a neural interface session, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the engineering core with my hand in the port, when Vishan's voice cut through the connection with the particular quality that meant it was important.
Kale,
The AI said. There is a vessel on approach. Cathari military configuration. It is broadcasting on the Imperial command frequency, and it is hailing us. I came out of the connection and sat up straight. How far? 18 minutes. At current approach velocity. I got to my feet. Can you get me a visual? The nearest display screen, one I had repaired 2 weeks ago, came to life with the feed from the ship's external sensors. The approaching vessel was smaller than the Vorath Shan, obviously, but it was built on the same design philosophy. Angular, layered, efficient, in a way that prioritized function over any aesthetic consideration. It was a Cathari intelligence vessel, fast and lightly armed compared to a dreadnought, but far better armed than anything I had access to personally. The hail was text-only on the first transmission. Short. Cathari Imperial Intelligence Vessel, Is Korath, to unidentified occupant of condemned vessel, Ix Vorath Shan. You are in violation of Galactic Maritime Law and Cathari Imperial Property Statutes. Depart the vessel immediately. This is your only notification. I read it twice. Then I sat down in what I had started calling the captain's chair, a piece of furniture in the communications room, large and designed for a species somewhat bigger than me, that I had nevertheless come to think of as mine, and composed a reply. I have not violated any law that applies to me. The Vorath Shan was abandoned and all legal claims to it were formally relinquished. I am conducting salvage operations under General Galactic Maritime Recovery Statutes. If you have specific legal documentation contradicting that position, I would be glad to review it. Otherwise, I am rather busy. I sent it. Vishan was quiet for 3 seconds. That is a bold reply. It is an accurate reply, I said. The response from the Cathari vessel took 4 minutes, which I took to mean that the officer in command was consulting with someone. When it came, it was audio. The voice was female, controlled, with the particular cadence of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed. and was currently choosing not to express how she felt about not being obeyed. This is Admiral Seveth of the Iskarath. You are a single human in a condemned military vessel. You have no legal standing, no support structure, and no leverage. I am telling you, human, as a matter of courtesy, to leave that ship before this conversation becomes something other than a conversation. I leaned forward in the chair. Admiral, I said, into the comm. With respect, I have been working on this ship for weeks. I am not leaving because someone shows up and repeats in an authoritative voice what a sign at the front already said. If you have legal documentation, please transmit it, and I will review it. If you do not, then we are finished talking. Another silence, longer this time. He said, with respect. A voice said in the background on the Cathari channel, speaking in Cathari that I could parse through my biotranslator. Does he know what that phrase means? Apparently not the way we mean it, a second voice replied. Then Admiral Seveth came back on, and her tone had shifted from controlled to something that was working harder at being controlled. Power down your systems, and prepare to be boarded. I looked at Vishan's display panel. Vishan, I said, still on the open channel. How are we looking? The AI's response came through the ship's speakers, audible on the comm. Weapons systems are active. Targeting solutions on the approaching vessel have been generated. I am ready. The silence from the Korath was the kind of silence that happens when people are looking at their own sensor readings with new expressions. I leaned back in the chair. Admiral Seveth, I said, I have work to do. Good day. I closed the channel. The Korath held its position for 40 minutes. Then it turned and left. I sat in the captain's chair for a while after, not moving. Kale, Vishan said, you should know. When I said I was ready, it was not a statement of readiness for conflict. I know, I said. I said it because I wanted her to leave, the AI continued. I wanted her to leave so that you could keep working. I do not wish to use weapons against anyone. I know, I said again. I know exactly what you meant. A pause. You did? You said it for the same reason I said I have work to do, I told the AI. Not as a threat. As a statement of what we are actually doing here. Vishan considered that. Yes, that is correct. Then we understand each other. Yes, the AI said quietly. I believe we do. Outside, the stars continued their slow turning, and the Vorath Shan, for the first time in 40 years, had refused to be dismissed. And somewhere in the galactic comm network, the word was beginning to travel. The ghost ship was awake, and it was not alone. The news moved through the galactic communications network the way news of the strange always does, faster than official channels, slower than rumor, and in a shape that no one had anticipated. Within 48 hours of my exchange with Admiral Seveth, 3 separate intelligence services had flagged the incident for their respective governing bodies. Within 72 hours, the Cathari Imperial Court had convened an emergency session on the status of the Vorath Shan. Within a week, I had received formal communications from 6 different entities, ranging from politely worded legal inquiries to what was technically a diplomatic communique, which meant someone had taken the time to have it officially sealed and delivered through a registered courier service, rather than simply transmitting it. I read all of them. I was not a lawyer, but I was intelligent, and I had a good reference library, and the reading confirmed what I had already believed. The legal position of every entity attempting to claim authority over the Vorath Shan was much weaker than they were presenting it. The Cathari had formally relinquished ownership after the second Vresi abandonment. The Vresi had filed a disclaimer of interest. The coalition had recorded the vessel as an unrecoverable loss. Under the general salvage provisions of the Galactic Maritime Accord, a document that every spacefaring civilization had signed, and which, specifically because it applied to all of them equally, no single party could rewrite unilaterally. A vessel, in an unclaimed debris field with abandoned ownership, was eligible for claim by the party conducting active salvage work. I was conducting active salvage work. I wrote a single reply to all 6 communications, tailored slightly for each recipient's preferred formality level, but conveying the same essential message. I was operating legally. If any party wished to dispute that, they were welcome to bring their case before a Maritime Accord arbitration panel. I would be happy to present my documentation. In the meantime, I had work to do. Vishan read over my replies before I sent them. These are very confident, the AI observed. They are accurate, I said, which is the foundation of confidence. The Cathari will not accept arbitration, Vishan said. They consider themselves above the accord in matters of military property. They signed the accord, I said. They did. They have also ignored portions of it, approximately 11 times in the past century, when it was inconvenient. Then this will be time number 12, that someone points out they cannot do that, I said, and sent the replies. The physical work on the ship was progressing well. The supply order from Pete Calloway had arrived 6 days after I sent it, delivered by an unmanned cargo pod that docked to the Vorath Shan's secondary bay without incident. I had spent 2 full days processing the delivery and getting everything into place. The polymer shielding went immediately to the living web conduit runs that needed it, and the difference in the web's signal quality after the repair was measurable and immediate. Vishan reported a 12% reduction in background conflict noise across the entire ship, which translated in my interface sessions to a noticeably clearer signal environment. The bio-neural amplifiers I placed in the core column housing, as Vishan directed, where they would increase the sensitivity of the living web's receptive capacity, and the coffee I put in the synthesis unit's custom profile library, and immediately made a large cup of, and sat down with it, and felt considerably better about everything. The neural interface sessions had been evolving in ways that continued to surprise me. By the 3rd week of daily practice, the conflicts in the living web had reduced enough that I could hold a connection for 2 hours without exhaustion. By the 4th week, I was beginning to experience something that went beyond simple conflict mediation. I was beginning to feel the ship's systems as coherent units, rather than isolated signals. Navigation had a character. Propulsion had a personality. Life support had a kind of steady reliability that felt, in the context of the connection, like a quiet and dependable presence. Vishan said this was consistent with what the original Cathari pilots had described in the early stages of bonding. The living web was beginning to recognize me. Recognize me how? I asked. Your neural pattern is becoming familiar to the web's receptive architecture, Vishan explained, in the same way that a person becomes familiar with the voice of someone they speak to every day. The web is learning to expect you, to accommodate you. Is that good? It is what the design intended, the AI said. Whether it is good is a question that depends on what you intend to do with it. It was a fair point. I had been careful not to think too far ahead about what this was going to become. There was too much work in front of me to spend much energy on the shape of the finish line, but the question was legitimate, and I held it in the back of my mind as I worked. The weapons grid was the last major system I had been avoiding, not because I was afraid of it, but because it was the most complex repair on the list, and I wanted to have the living web stable enough to assist before I attempted it. The weapons grid was where the original design's genius and its problems were most visibly concentrated. It was integrated with the living web more deeply than any other system, because in battle, the web needed to respond to targeting decisions faster than any manual control system could manage. That deep integration was also why it had been the source of the most dramatic failures during the Vresi ownership period. Without a bonded pilot mind to give the web context for weapons activity, the grid had repeatedly powered up without command, had locked onto targets that did not exist, had, according to the incident reports in Vishan's logs, once charged to full power while the Vresi crew was sitting at anchor doing routine maintenance. The Vresi engineers had seen the power readings, had watched their own ship prepare to fire at nothing, and had made the entirely understandable decision to get off immediately and never come back. I needed to fix the weapons grid, but I needed to fix it in a way that had never been tried before. I spent 3 days designing the approach. The core problem was that the Cathari architecture and human engineering philosophy had never been combined at this level of system integration. The living web used biosynthetic signal pathways that operated on biological principles. Human electromagnetic engineering was built on entirely different foundations. Making them communicate with each other should not have been possible. I thought about this for a long time, over many cups of coffee, sitting in the engineering core, while Vishan answered my questions about the Cathari design specifications, and I cross-referenced them with every human engineering reference in my portable library. The answer I arrived at was not elegant. It was, in the way of most engineering solutions that actually work, rather obvious in retrospect. I did not need to make the two systems understand each other directly. I needed to make them agree on an intermediate language, a translation layer, not between machine and machine, but between two fundamentally different approaches to the same problem. I built it over 5 days, working with materials from the supply order, and components I repurposed from secondary systems, that the Vorath-Shan could function without. V-Shan helped with every step, offering specifications and flagging potential conflicts before I reached them. The AI had become, over the weeks, an unusually effective collaborator. It knew exactly what it knew, and it knew exactly what it did not know, and it communicated both with equal clarity. When the translation layer was installed and I ran the first diagnostic of the integrated weapons grid, V-Shan went quiet. Not briefly quiet. The AI was silent for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which I tracked because the silence was unusual enough to notice. V-Shan, I said, talk to me. I am running the yield calculations, the AI said. I have run them 3 times. And? Another pause. Kale. These numbers are not consistent with the original design specifications. Meaning what? Meaning the integrated system is producing theoretical yield values that are approximately 40% higher than the design ceiling, V-Shan said. I do not have a clear explanation for why. The combination of the biosynthetic signal pathways with the human electromagnetic architecture is producing a resonance effect that amplifies the weapon output beyond what either system could achieve independently. I sat down slowly. Is that a problem? I asked. It is not a problem in the sense of instability, V-Shan said. The systems are coherent. They are stable. They are simply more powerful than they should be. A pause. Than anything like them has ever been, as far as my records indicate. I looked at the display screen, showing the weapons grid diagnostic. The numbers were, as V-Shan had said, very large. Run it again, I said. V-Shan ran it again. The numbers were the same. I was still sitting with that information, turning it over in my mind and thinking about what it meant and what I intended to do about it, when the proximity alert sounded. Not a single vessel this time. The sensor display lit up with 7 contact markers, all on direct approach vectors, all small and fast, and configured in the loose formation that tactical databases categorized as attack spread. Kale, V-Shan said, I am reading 7 vessels. Pirate configuration. Mixed registry. They are not broadcasting identification. I looked at the contact markers. 7 ships, converging fast. They know what we've been doing here, I said. Yes, V-Shan agreed. Someone who was watching the comm channels has decided that a ship with weapons systems active and a single-person crew is worth the risk. I stood up and walked to the captain's chair with the steady, deliberate step of someone who has decided how a situation is going to go. V-Shan, I said, settling into the seat. How are we looking? The AI's response was immediate. All systems are active. The living web is at the best coherence level we have achieved. I have targeting solutions on all 7 vessels. And Kale. A pause. I believe I am ready. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not from fear. From the particular kind of stillness that comes just before something happens that you have been preparing for without quite knowing it. Then I opened my eyes and reached for the interface port that V-Shan had installed in the arm of the captain's chair 3 days ago, at my request, for exactly this kind of moment. My hand went in. The living web opened around me, and it was different this time. Not the storm it had been in those first sessions, not even the manageable complexity it had become through weeks of daily practice. It was clear. It was ready. Every system of the Vorath-Shan, arranged around my awareness, like instruments waiting for a conductor's signal. Let's show them what we built, I said. The 7 vessels came in fast, which was a mistake. Fast approaches work against an opponent who needs time to respond. The Vorath-Shan did not need time. It had been waiting, in one form or another, for 40 years. The first thing I did surprised even me. I did not fire. Through the living web, I could feel the weapons grid's readiness, the vast capacity I had built into it, the power sitting ready and coiled. I could have used it to end the engagement before it fully began. 7 ships against a weapons system of this caliber would not have been a contest. It would have been an erasure. I chose not to do it that way. The first two ships that opened fire on the Vorath Shan hit a vessel whose hull was rated for impacts substantially beyond what their weapons could produce. The energy simply dissipated across the layered armor plate. I felt the hits through the living web, but they registered as data, not damage. The Vorath Shan absorbed them the way a mountain absorbs rain. I targeted the lead vessel's propulsion array with surgical precision and hit it at 1/4 power. The ship spun out of its approach vector and went dark. Not destroyed, simply stopped. I moved immediately to the second ship, which had positioned itself for a flanking approach, and targeted its communications array. It went offline, blind and unable to coordinate. The third and fourth ships were moving together, which told me they had done this before. A coordinated approach designed to split defensive attention. I did not split my attention. I targeted the structural coupling that connected their formation, a physical tether they were using to maintain precise positioning, and I dissolved it with a focused pulse. They separated. Their coordination broke. I let them go for 30 seconds to see what they would do without a plan. What they did was panic, which was informative. Vishan spoke to me through the web connection while the battle continued. Not commands. Observations. The fifth vessel is moving toward the debris field. It is attempting to use the asteroids as cover. And then, the sixth ship has powered down its weapons. It is broadcasting on the civilian distress frequency. The sixth ship is surrendering, I said. Yes, Vishan agreed. And the seventh has turned and is running at full acceleration. I let the seventh go. I let the fifth, still hiding in the debris field, come to its own decision about what to do next. It took about 8 minutes. Then it too broadcast on the distress frequency. 3 ships surrendered that day. 4 had been disabled or had fled. Not one had been destroyed. I came out of the web connection and sat in the captain's chair and breathed carefully and evenly while my hands stopped shaking. They shook for about 90 seconds and then they stopped, and I noted the duration professionally in my internal log and then looked at the ceiling of the communications room for a while. Kale, Vishan said, you did not use the full capability of the weapons system. I know, I said. You could have ended the engagement in the first 30 seconds. I know, I said again. Why did you not? I thought about how to answer that. Because ending a fight quickly and ending it cleanly are two different things, I said. Ending it quickly with maximum force leaves wreckage and casualties, and a story that spreads as a warning. Ending it cleanly, the way we did it, leaves 7 crews who all survived and who now have a very specific story to tell. What story? Vishan asked. That the ghost ship is awake. That whoever is on it chose not to destroy them when they had every reason to. That it would be considerably smarter to make different choices in the future. A long pause from Vishan. You wanted them to tell the story. A living witness is more persuasive than wreckage, I said. That is something I learned from watching how conflicts actually end, rather than how they happen to stop. The AI was quiet for a moment. I had not considered that distinction, it said. Conflict ends. Conflicts stop. They are not the same. No, I said. They are not. I learned something from watching you today, Vishan said. I looked up at the amber light above the communications board. What did you learn? That the way you do something is as important as what you do, the AI said. The Cathari who built me believed that maximum force at maximum efficiency was the definition of effective action. You demonstrated today that effective action can include choosing not to use what you have. It can, I said. And knowing when that is the right choice is harder than knowing how to fight. The battle footage, captured by the sensors of the fleeing 7th ship, was broadcasting on 3 galactic commercial channels within 19 hours. I know this because Vishan was monitoring the comm networks as a matter of course, and flagged the first broadcast before I had finished reviewing my own sensor data from the engagement. I watched the footage once. It was strange to watch. To see the Vorath Shan from outside, moving with a precision and a deliberateness that did not match anyone's expectations of a derelict ship, disabling attackers without destroying them, choosing its responses with obvious care. Several of the comm channels that picked up the footage ran analyses alongside it. Most of the analysts were confused. The Vorath Shan had fought like a military vessel, but made choices that no military doctrine they were aware of would have recommended. One Cathari analyst, watching the footage on a news service I had never heard of, said something that Vishan translated for me. "This is not how a Cathari ship fights," the analyst said. "This is not how any ship fights. I do not have a category for what this is." I thought that was a reasonable summary. Admiral Savath, I would learn later, watched the footage in her command room with her senior staff, and when it was finished, she asked for 2 minutes of silence, which she received without question, and then she made a decision that she kept private for several weeks. The political responses came within 24 hours of the footage's spread. The Cathari Imperial Court issued a second demand for the immediate surrender of the Vorath Shan. The Vresi Collective issued a statement noting that they had long maintained the ship was dangerous and that events had now confirmed this. The Galactic Coalition sent a diplomatic envoy, a Felian official named Orvas, who arrived in a small, clean vessel and requested permission to dock. I granted it. Orvas came aboard alone, which I appreciated. He was a small being, about 1.5 meters in height, with the wide, reflective eyes of a species adapted to low-light environments, and the careful, deliberate movements of someone who was choosing every action with great awareness. He looked at the interior of the Vorath Shan, now clean, lit, running, with an expression I could read even across species lines. Surprise. "You have done considerable work," he said. His universal translator gave him a pleasant, neutral voice. "I have," I agreed. He had an offer. Several, delivered in ascending order of what he clearly thought was attractiveness. Money first. A substantial sum, enough to make me comfortable for years. Then a legal settlement formalizing my claim over the Vorath Shan, in exchange for the ship being placed under Coalition oversight. Then a personal title in the Coalition's honorary registry, which I gathered was considered significant in Felian culture. I declined all of them. Orvas looked at me for a long moment with those wide, reflective eyes. "What do you want?" he asked. "To finish my work," I said. "Your work," he repeated. "The ship still needs attention," I said. "The living web is not fully stable. There are systems I have not yet addressed. I have a job to do, and I would like to continue doing it." Orvas was quiet for a moment. "And when the job is finished, what then?" "I will make a decision about what comes next when I have more information," I said. "That is how decisions should be made." He left without a resolution, which was what I had expected. But he left politely, and he did not make threats, and that told me something about how the Coalition read the situation. I was back in the engineering core within an hour, running the next phase of the living web stabilization protocol, with Vishan tracking every metric and the amber light burning steadily above the central column. I was finishing my work, and the galaxy, having now seen what was being finished, was beginning to wonder what exactly it had become. It was Vishan who found the signal, and when it came, the AI did not immediately tell me what it was. It sat with the data for 3 hours, processing and reprocessing, running translation algorithms against a language archive that stretched back further than any of the current galactic civilizations, before it finally spoke. I was in the lower engineering deck, working on a secondary conduit run, when Vishan's voice came through the local speaker panel. "KL," it said, "you need to come to the communications room." The tone was the one the AI used when something was important enough to not explain over a work channel. I put down my tools and went. The communications room's main display was showing a signal trace. I looked at it without immediately understanding what I was seeing. It was not a standard transmission format. It was not any format I recognized. The wave pattern was complex in a way that felt almost organic, like the structure of something grown rather than built. "Where is this from?" I asked. "I am not certain," Vishan said. "I have been attempting to triangulate the origin for the past 3 hours. The signal does not appear to be traveling through normal subspace channels. It appears to be traveling through the living web." I looked at the display, and then at Vishan's central column. "Through the living web. Our living web. Yes. Who has access to the living web besides us?" "No one," Vishan said. "In theory. But the living web was designed by architects who were not the Cathari. The Cathari adapted it from an older source. The language this signal is encoded in is consistent with that older source." I turned from the display and looked at the amber light. "The precursors," I said. "Yes. Vishan said quietly. I believe so. Everything I knew about the precursors could fit in a short paragraph. They were the civilization whose technology had seeded the design philosophy that the Cathari and several other species had built their own engineering traditions on top of. They were believed to be extinct, had been believed to be extinct for so long that most current galactic scholarship treated them as mythological rather than historical. The evidence of their existence was indirect. Design patterns in Cathari architecture that could not have been independently developed. Mathematical structures in certain natural phenomena that showed signs of having been arranged rather than occurring. Occasional artifacts recovered from deep survey missions that no current species could fully analyze. Vishan had mentioned them, briefly, early in our time together. The Cathari had adapted the living web from precursor designs. I had noted it and moved on, because there was always more immediate work to do. I was looking at that now with fresh attention. I spent an hour with Vishan, translating the signal. It was not a message in any narrative sense. It was more like a coordinate set, combined with what the AI described as a formal recognition marker, something that said, in the grammar of a very old and very precise language, we see you. We know what you have done. Come here. The coordinates pointed to a star system 2 weeks' travel from the drift. I sat in the captain's chair for a long time after Vishan, and I finished the translation. Do you think we should go? I asked. I think, Vishan said carefully, that this signal is the most significant thing that has happened since you boarded this ship, which means it is the most significant thing that has happened to me in 40 years. I am not able to pretend to be indifferent to it. That is not an answer to my question. No, the AI agreed. It is not. A pause. I think we should go, because I believe not going would be a kind of dishonesty. We have done something unusual. Something that required more than skill. Someone or something has noticed. Ignoring that would be pretending that what we have done is less than it is. I thought about that for a while. Then I stood up, went to the helm station, and began calculating the jump coordinates. Set course, I said. Already done, Vishan replied. The jump took us through 3 standard transit points and 1 deep space transit corridor that Vishan navigated from its own charts, which were older and more detailed than any commercially available navigation data. The Vorath Shan moved through transit space with a smoothness that still struck me sometimes. The living web's integration with the propulsion array made the ship feel less like a machine in motion, and more like something that chose to be somewhere and simply arrived there. 2 weeks. I used the time to complete the remaining work on the conduit systems and to run the living web through a full extended duration stability test. The test ran for 9 days without interruption, the longest continuous connection I had maintained, and when I came out of it I was tired in a deep and unusual way, not physically, but cognitively, as if the parts of my brain that handled sustained complexity had been running at full capacity for a very long time and needed quiet. Vishan noticed. You should rest, the AI said. I can manage the ship for several days without your input. I know, I said. And yet you continue working. I will rest when we get there. Kale, Vishan said. The tone was the one I had come to associate with the AI, making a decision to say something it was uncertain how I would receive. You take better care of the ship than you take of yourself. Is that a criticism? It is an observation, Vishan said. The ship is important. I understand why it feels urgent. But you are also important. You are, in fact, the reason any of this is possible. And you are finite in ways that I am not. And I would prefer you to remain operational. I stopped what I was doing and looked at the nearest speaker panel for a moment. You would prefer that, I said. Yes, Vishan said, not elaborating, not explaining, just the simple statement. I put my tools down. I went to my bunk. I slept for 14 hours. The system we arrived at was a dead star and a single artificial structure. The star had long since exhausted its fuel and collapsed, and it sat in the center of its former planetary system, like a cold, dark mass, giving nothing. The structure was in orbit around it, not large by the standards of the ships I had been working with, perhaps 2 kilometers along its longest axis, but built with a precision that made everything else I had seen look rough and approximate by comparison. Every surface was exact. Every angle was deliberate. It was the work of builders who had not been in a hurry, and had not needed to compromise. I brought the Vorath Shan into a matching orbit, and we sat and looked at it.
It is not transmitting on any frequency, Vishan said.
But the living web is receiving a signal from it. A different signal than the one that reached us in the drift. This one is an invitation. To enter? I asked. Yes. I suited up. I took my toolkit out of habit. I docked the Vera to the station's exterior. The Vera, my original salvage skiff, which I had not been inside in weeks, and which greeted me with the familiar smell of old metal and processed air that I had not realized I had missed. I crossed to the station's airlock, which opened for me before I touched it, and went in. The interior was lit, not brightly, but with a steady and even illumination that seemed to come from the walls themselves. There were no controls visible, no panels, no displays, just a series of long corridors that led inward, toward a central space. I walked through them, and they felt like the inside of something that had been designed to be walked through, like a path, not an accident. The central space was a chamber about 30 meters across, with a high curved ceiling. The walls were covered in material that caught the light and organized it into patterns that changed slowly, like very calm water. In the center of the chamber, there was a flat surface at about table height, and on the surface was a display projection, not a screen, but an actual three-dimensional rendering of data, hanging in the air with a clarity that made my own equipment feel primitive. The data was a history. Vishan, connected to the living web, and therefore receiving everything the station transmitted, provided real-time translation. The history was long, and we moved through it together, the AI narrating, while I stood in the chamber and watched the projections change. The precursors had not been destroyed. They had not gone extinct in the way that a species fails and disappears. They had made a choice. They had reached a point in their development where they understood clearly that the decision to remain or to move forward was a genuine decision, with real consequences either way, and they had chosen to move forward into something that the translation did not have precise words for, something beyond the stage of civilization that any current galactic species occupied. Before they had left, they had prepared. They had built things to be found later, by civilizations that were still developing. Not gifts, exactly. More like tests. The living web design was one of them. They had seeded it into the Cathari design tradition, knowing that it would eventually produce a ship, eventually, perhaps thousands of years hence, that would only reach its full function when a mind bonded with it in the right way, not dominating it, not commanding it, but negotiating with it, listening to it, treating it as a partner rather than a tool. They had built the Vorath Shan, in other words, to wait for someone like me, and they had built this station to activate when someone like me arrived. The station's archive held the full precursor design library, every system, every principle, every approach that their civilization had developed, across what the projection indicated was a period of time, roughly 10 times longer than all current galactic recorded history combined. It held the complete specifications for the living web in its full intended form, rather than the adapted version the Cathari had implemented. And it held, at the very center of the archive, one final piece of data. There were 40 other vessels built on the Cathari design template that incorporated incomplete versions of the living web, derelicts scattered across the galaxy, ships that had been built with pieces of the precursor design but had never had the complete picture, and had therefore never fully functioned. The station's signal could reach all of them through the living web network that connected them, a network that had been dormant for as long as the ships themselves had been abandoned. The Vorath Shan, now fully operational and fully bonded, was the key. Through it, all 40 ships could be brought online. I stood in the chamber for a long time after the projection finished. Vishan's voice came through my suit communicator. KL, you understand what this means. 40 warships, I said. All of them activated and connected through the living web, all of them with the same capability enhancement that the Vorath Shan has. Yes. I looked at the archive projection, still turning slowly in the air in front of me. Vishan, I said, what do you think I should do? The AI's pause was the longest I had ever experienced from it. Long enough that I checked my communicator to make sure the signal was still active. It was. Vishan was thinking. I think, the AI said finally, that you have never wanted a weapon. You have wanted to fix things. From the first moment you boarded this ship, you were looking at what was broken and thinking about how to make it whole. Not to use it, but because something broken is something that is not what it should be, and you find that unacceptable. That is accurate, I said. 40 warships are 40 things that have been sitting broken and alone in the dark, Vishan said. They are not weapons, unless they are used as weapons. What they are, before that decision is made, is 40 ships that need to be what they were built to be. I walked back out through the corridor and into the airlock and across to the Vera, and I sat in the pilot seat of my old salvage skiff for a while, in the space where I had started all of this, broke in 4 currencies and looking for scrap. When the diplomatic convoy arrived 3 days later, 7 vessels representing 4 different galactic powers, having tracked my transit path through the comm network activity my presence had generated, I met them in the Vorath Shan's main reception bay, which I had spent 1 day cleaning and making presentable. Vishan had suggested the effort. It had been correct. There were 11 representatives in total: Cathari, Coalition, Vresi, and 3 smaller species whose names I had only recently looked up because they had not previously been involved. They sat across a long table from me, and they were all very carefully controlled, and they were all, behind that control, afraid. I understood why. 1 human, 1 ship, the key to 40 more. It was the kind of power that the galactic community had not seen concentrated in a single point in its recorded history, and they did not know what I was going to do with it. Admiral Sevath was among the Cathari delegation. She looked at me across the table with an expression I read as exhausted respect. I nodded to her. She nodded back. The representatives made their cases. The Cathari wanted the ships deactivated and turned over to Imperial authority. The Coalition wanted them placed under joint galactic oversight. The Vresi wanted them left alone, which was the most consistent position any of them had taken throughout this entire affair. The 3 smaller species wanted representation in whatever governing body was created to manage them. I listened to all of it. I asked clarifying questions when I needed to, and I made notes, and when each party had finished I sat quietly for a moment before I spoke. I am going to activate all 40 ships, I said. The room went very still. I am going to reconfigure their primary systems before activation, using the precursor archive. The war doctrine programming in their cores will be removed. The tactical priority hierarchies will be rebuilt from scratch. Each ship will be configured as a deep space operations platform, disaster response, medical support, exploration, and search and rescue capability. Nobody spoke for a moment. You are going to take 40 warships and turn them into relief vessels, said the Coalition representative slowly. That is correct, I said. Why? Said the Vresi representative. Because there are more things in this galaxy that need fixing than there are things that need fighting, I said. And because 40 ships operating on that mission, with the capabilities the precursor design gives them, would have a measurable positive effect on the situations that currently cost galactic societies the most resources to manage inadequately. Another silence. Longer this time. You said you would remove the war doctrine programming, Admiral Sevath said. Her voice was carefully neutral. All of it? Most of it, I said. 2 of the 40 will retain defensive military capability. At full spec. Because the ships operating as relief vessels need to be safe from exactly the kind of people who attacked this ship 3 weeks ago. The Admiral looked at me. And who commands those 2 ships? She asked. That, I said, is a question for a later conversation. The first conversation we need to have is whether anyone at this table is going to contest what I have just told you, and if so, on what grounds. No one contested it. Not immediately. There was a great deal of negotiation over the following days: structure, oversight, operational protocols, legal frameworks for a fleet that did not fit any existing category. I participated in all of it, alongside Vishan, who monitored everything and kept me accurate on technical specifications and historical precedent. The framework that emerged was imperfect, as all negotiated frameworks are, but it was functional, and it gave the smaller species genuine representation, and it placed the relief fleet under a governing structure that no single power could unilaterally override. I spent the next 4 months activating the ships, one by one, traveling to each location in the Vorath Shan, with a small crew of volunteers I had recruited from 3 different species, who shared the specific combination of technical skill and genuine curiosity that the work required. Each activation was different. Each ship had its own history, its own character, its own particular way of waking up after a long time in the dark. Vishan helped me through each one, drawing on the full precursor archive to guide the reconfiguration process. On the day I activated the last ship, a smaller vessel that had been sitting in a stable orbit around a gas giant at the edge of explored space, overlooked by every surveyor who had passed through the system, I sat in the Vorath Shan's bridge alone afterward and looked at the star chart. 38 relief platforms, 2 defensive escorts, a fleet that had no name yet and no precedent in galactic history. Vishan spoke after a while. Kale. Yeah, I said. Where do we go first? I looked at the star chart. It was full of destinations, full of places where things were broken and needed fixing. I could spend the rest of my life going from one to the next and not reach them all, and new ones would appear before I finished with the old ones, because that was the nature of a galaxy that was still figuring out how to take care of itself. Somewhere that needs fixing, I said. The AI was quiet for a moment. Then, naturally, I set a course. The Vorath Shan moved, smooth and certain, the living web carrying us forward with the ease of something that had finally, after a very long time, found its proper direction. Beside us in the fleet formation, 39 other ships moved too, each one lit and alive and purposeful in ways none of them had been before. Outside the viewport, the stars stretched away in every direction, uncountable and ancient, and completely indifferent to the small and persistent life that had decided to make something of itself among them. I found, as I always did when I looked at them long enough, that I was fine with that. We would make something of it anyway. That was, in the end, what humans did.